Hello, good afternoon everybody. My name's Shona Crichton. I'm a speech and language therapist, currently working as a professional advisor with the Communication Trust. I've been asked by Ethel today to come to speak to you about the process of identifying children who you may be seeing who may have speech, language and communication needs. And I hope you find it interesting. We'll go on to the next slide. Thank you. So the Communication Trust is part of a consortium of lots of non-for-profit organisations, some of which are listed on your slide there, and all of these organisations have a particular interest or a focus on children's communication. I'm hoping that today you will go away with an understanding of the importance of the early identification of children who might have speech, language and communication needs, and also some of the principles that will hopefully help you with identifying some of the children that you're seeing. I'm also hoping it will give you a nice overview of how you might be able to recognise children who are presenting with speech, language and communication needs, and also think about some of the tools and some of the resources that are available to you to help you with being able to identify these children. In terms of the learning outcomes, you'll be able to understand the importance of early identification of SLCN, which is speech, language and communication needs. You'll be able to understand some principles in order to allow you to effectively identify children who may present with SLCN. Hopefully you'll be aware of some different ways that children might not always follow a typical speech and language developmental pattern, and how to identify those children who aren't following a typical developmental pattern, and also become aware of some of the tools and resources to help you. So I'm hoping that maybe a few of you or all of you were signed in to listen to Lisa, my colleague's presentation that she did back in July, which was just about understanding speech, language and communication. Just in case a little bit of revision is required from some of that, I just wanted to talk you through really making sure that you're aware of the distinction between the terms speech, language and communication. So I've just popped that into a table for you on this slide, just being aware that when we talk about speech, we're thinking about speech sounds, that might be the pronunciation of words. We're thinking about fluency, so that's really stammering or stuttering, that falls under that category. Volume, so some children have problems with the volume of their speech, they find it difficult to monitor that. Intonation, some children may find it very difficult to manage the intonation of their speech, so where you or I might go up at the end of a question, they're not understanding that aspect, and also pitch. And when we think about language, we're thinking about the understanding of language, so being able to understand words and using words and their meanings. Also think about how words go together, so that ability to put words together to make a sentence, and also how we can change word order around and it affects the meaning. It's about grammar, so for example when we would put ed at the end of a verb to make a past tense, some children take a long while to understand that. Joining sentences to make a narrative, so to tell a story, to talk about something that's happened at the weekend, or to tell a story that they want to tell you, and also higher level skills like reasoning, problem solving, being able to talk about why something's happened or how something's happened. All of those fall under the category of language. And then when we think about communication, we're thinking about particularly non-verbal communication, so things like using appropriate eye contact, body language, facial expressions, using gestures, using sign we're thinking about children being able to understand the rules of conversation, turn taking, how to take turns, how to change a topic if they need to. So communication is really thinking more about interaction skills, and there are some children who find that aspect of their communication very difficult. Sometimes children may have speech, language and communication needs, and those needs can sometimes go undetected for varying reasons. I think really when we're thinking about early identification of SLCN, really the earliest that you can identify a child who has needs and get them the support that they need, obviously the more able they will be to reach their potential. When we think about speech and language and communication, we're really thinking about that they are really key skills that underpin many areas of development, and they need to be in place as a foundation in order for children to build on many other skills that they'll need to learn, many life skills. So things like literacy, their behaviour, their social development, their emotional development. Without an adequate foundation of speech, language and communication, those children will struggle to develop in some of those other areas, which obviously will affect them in later life. So really we're thinking about making sure that early identification happens as soon as possible to enable children to have the support that they need. And I've spoken already about some of those impacts in terms of other areas of development that may well be impacted if there are problems with speech, language and communication. Just a little bit more on why identifying children early on is very important in terms of the impact that may have on them later in life if some of their difficulties aren't picked up. The impacts for children and young people with SLCN can be very many and very wide-ranging. I think I have put in your reference list a reference to an ICANN talk paper, which is called The Cost to the Nation, which details some of the impacts that that children with speech, language and communication needs may have as a result of their difficulties. And there is plenty of evidence for us to show that if children are identified early and are provided with the right support, then they make very good progress, particularly those children who we see where they won't necessarily have a long-term or a persistent difficulty, but they're just presenting with a little bit of delay. They're a little bit behind where they should be for their age. Those are the children where if we can identify them early and provide them with the support that they need, those are the children who tend to make great progress and who then later on in life don't have any further difficulties. I noted down a few references that you might find interest, a few statistics and references. So 50 to 90% of children who have speech, language and communication needs go on to have reading difficulties. At the end of a primary school education, typically 80% of all children will achieve the expected level in English, but only 25% of children with speech, language and communication needs will reach that same level. If language difficulties are resolved by the age of 5.5, students are more likely to go on to develop good reading skills. So that really pushes home the importance of that early identification of some of those needs. And 2/3 of 7 to 14-year-olds with serious behaviour problems also have an additional language impairment. So there's really a very strong case for us all as health professionals to to really be aware of what speech, language and communication difficulties may look like, and also, you know, we're in a really strong position to be able to identify those and get the support in required as soon as possible, just to try and minimise some of those impacts. Again, this diagram just further illustrates that speech, language and communication are really a central life skill, and without those skills, the other areas of development are affected. And there's lots of research indicating strong links, that children with SLCN have difficulties with peer relationships, demonstrating pro-social behaviour, their educational attainment. So it's really just illustrating again that speech, language and communication is so central in developing many other skills. I know Lisa spoke to you recently at the previous Thinking Thursday seminar about some of the factors and the causes of SLCN, ranging from you know, an impoverished language environment to a neurological difficulty such as cerebral palsy. So the factors involved in speech language communication needs are very varied. In terms of the prevalence and the numbers of children that we see with SLCN, these are the children that we're talking about who don't follow the expected pattern of speech, language and communication development for whatever reason. And difficulties in these areas are surprisingly common. I've spoken a bit about the factors already, and that there can be a number of factors which are linked to SLCN. For some children, sometimes we don't know what the cause is. But the important thing is the identification. We don't need to know the cause in order to provide them with the support that they need. Sort of recent statistics indicate that about 10% of children have a long-term and persistent speech, language and communication needs. About 1% have very severe and complex needs, and recent studies are showing that it can be, in some areas of social disadvantage, that there are 50% of children who have delayed speech, language and communication development. So there's been lots recently about the numbers of children sort of starting in nursery education without having adequate language skills that they require in order for them to thrive within that learning environment. So thinking about kind of our role in recognising children and young people who have speech, language and communication needs, in terms of having the ability to identify and to notice when a child is not developing those skills in the way that we would expect, we really need to have a really good understanding of some of the ages and the stages of development. So that idea that, you know, by age 2 we would expect X, Y and Z, by age 3, and having that familiarity of what we're looking for in terms of speech, language and communication milestones at each age is really crucial. The Communication Trust does have a free resource called Universally Speaking, excuse me, which is which presents all those communication milestones from birth right up to, I think it's 16. So those are available on the Communication Trust website and are in the resource list at the end of the presentation. We also have, as a practitioner, we have a strong ability to be able to observe and record what a child can do, as well as looking at the things that they might find difficult and thinking about whether they're finding some aspects of life difficult because they have some speech, language and communication difficulties. We also need to be aware that sometimes we might see a child with poor behaviour, but actually underlying that are some speech, language and communication needs. So it's about considering that that might be another aspect that's going on in that child's life. So we might see the behaviour, but sometimes we might need to look at speech, language and communication needs being a part of that. It's also really important in getting the views of the child themselves, if that's a possibility, if you're working with children who are old enough, or certainly their parents or their carers or caregivers who know those children well. So discussing concerns with them, thinking about how are they presenting at home, what sorts of things are they finding difficult, that kind of thing. It's about using tools and resources to help you to recognise where there may be a difficulty, and it's also about making sure that any concerns are shared with others, and in particular if there's any onward referrals that need to be made, that you feel confident that you've recognised that need and that you feel confident to make any onward referrals as necessary to allow for the support to be put in place. I just wanted to make a quick note. I'm sure many of you work with children and young people in families where English is not their first language. So it's really just to make sure that we're all aware that children who are learning an additional language, if they are learning their home language adequately, then they don't have any speech, language and communication needs. That's not to say that children who are bilingual or learning more than one language won't have any SLCN, but what we need to look at is whether they're having difficulties in their home language. That's really the key thing. If they're having difficulties in their home language as well as with acquiring English, that's when they would need some additional support. And it can be very tricky, this sort of cohort of children who are bilingual or learning English as a second language. It can sometimes be really quite tricky to identify those children who've got additional speech, language and communication needs, and that's really where gathering views of parents is really crucial, because it means that you can get a full understanding of what's happening at home in terms of home language development, or if you've got any bilingual colleagues, then they can be a great help in being able to identify whether children are developing well in their home language. SLCN can be quite tricky to identify, purely because every child obviously is an individual, and every child's needs can be very different and varying and individual to them. So it might be that they might only have one area of difficulty, so it may only be in one area, or it may be in all areas of SLC there is speech, language and communication. So it might be that you have a child who has a stammer, but in terms of all the other areas of their communication and language and speech development, they're developing really well. Or you may have a child who speaks a lot and seems to have very, very good language skills. However, when it comes to interacting with other people, playing with friends, that's where their difficulties lie. So they're having more of a difficulty with the communication aspect. So it can be quite difficult in terms of being able to identify exactly where some of those difficulties are lying. Also, children will vary in terms of the level of the need that they require, and therefore the possible impact of those SLCN. So some children may have very, very severe needs, whereas others may just have maybe a slight difficulty with pronunciation. Obviously, if the severity of the need is much more severe, then the impact also will usually be more severe as well. So it's really thinking about being able to identify those children where their needs may be more severe, but equally, a child who's having difficulty with pronunciation, there may also be huge impacts from that in terms of self-esteem, confidence, literacy development. So it's about just being aware of all of the range. For some children, speech, language and communication might be their only need, so that it may be a very isolated difficulty for them, or it might be something that's part of a much bigger picture, some general learning difficulties, or an additional syndrome like Down syndrome or something like that. We also need to look at whether their speech, language and communication skills are following a delayed pattern, or whether the pattern is looking a bit more atypical. So a delayed pattern would be a 3-year-old who is presenting as a 2-year-old. That means that they are developing the skills, they're just developing them a little bit slower, so that's delayed. In terms of disordered, it might be where, for example, the child's use of language and their talking is great, but their understanding of language is really poor, and that shows a very unusual pattern of development, because normally for all children they will understand a lot more than they say. And then we also need to think about whether their need might be a short-term need or something that's more long-term and persistent. And again, if it's something that's short-term, it's still really, really crucial to identify that, to minimise the impact and to make it as short-term as possible. And equally for those children who will have a lifelong difficulty with speech, language and communication, it's still crucial for us to get in there early and provide them with the support that they need as soon as possible. This slide just helps you to see some of the things to sort of look out for in terms of being able to identify children who are having problems with speech, language and communication. So what they may present with, what you may see is a difficulty with playing with others, difficulties with social interaction or peer relationships, literacy difficulties, behaviour difficulties, problems with their confidence or their self-esteem. So sometimes what we can actually observe and see are difficulties in those areas, and then what's underlying is that there's a speech, language and communication need going on there that is impacting on those other areas of that child's life. In terms of recognising SLCN, really in terms of the resources and the tools, I think there's kind of two main approaches, one of which is what we've spoken about previously, about those kind of ages and stages resources. So they're there to allow us to see whether a child is at the stage that would be expected for their age. So are they meeting all the speech and language and communication milestones that we would expect for a child of that age? If not, having a look at where they are at, and also looking at ways to get them the support that they need, or looking at finding out some advice for you to be able to support them, or their parents to be able to support them. Also, as well as the ages and stages resources, there's also some sort of published indicator checklists, and what these tend to do is kind of highlight behaviours that the child or the young person might be presenting with that would then indicate that there's a problem. So they don't show you the kind of the norms and the typical development. They would probably show you more, they'd look more at the difficulties and whether you would tick off whether they were having some of those difficulties, and that would therefore indicate that there was a speech and language and communication need. Also, you might find that in some areas where you work, perhaps some of the referral forms to speech and language therapy services might even indicate sort of referral criteria, and have some of those indicators on the referral forms, which will really help you with decision making around whether to make a referral or not for a child. I just thought it might be quite useful to look at a couple of case studies, and just to think about kind of unpicking how these children can sometimes present, and the ways in which you might be able to go about sort of recognising and identifying and getting the support for these needs. So the first little case study I've put on here is a little boy called George. He's 11. He's very high achieving in school. He's very good at maths. He's a very talkative boy, but he can be very difficult to follow in terms of his conversations, as he will assume that the listener already knows what he's talking about. He often doesn't stick to the topic of conversation, or he'll talk a lot about what he is interested in, giving lots of very minute detail. He doesn't look at people when he's talking or listening, and when he speaks there tends to be very little expression in his voice. George will often take things very literally. So, for example, if his teacher asks, "Can you shut the door, please?" he responds with yes, as he doesn't understand that his teacher actually wants him to shut the door. And he doesn't understand idioms like I was high as a kite, or at the drop of a hat, or pull your socks up, like those kinds of that kind of ambiguous language. So in terms of George, when we think about the three aspects of speech, language, and communication, for George, it would appear that his speech is developing fine. There's no difficulties there with his pronunciation or his fluency. It looks to us as though his language is developing quite well. He's high achieving. He's very talkative. However, really, with George, we're thinking that there will be some difficulties in terms of his communication. So he's not understanding some of those non-verbal rules, things like using eye contact, things like taking turns in a conversation, things like not dominating a conversation with only something that you're interested in. So for a child like George, a speech and language kind of ages and stage resource might not show up some of the difficulties that he's having. For George, it might be a case of going to observe him at his school, looking at what he's doing when he's talking with his peers, and only then might some of his difficulties be apparent. So for a child like George, you might need to use more of an indicator checklist, and there are some for looking at, particularly for children who have got difficulties in their social communication. There is a free resource called the Pragmatics Profile, which can be downloaded, and that takes the form of an interview that you would complete with the child's teacher or main caregiver, and it really looks at whether there are elements in terms of their social communication to be concerned about. So we'd probably do something like that for George. The next child here is Molly. So she's initially described as language delayed, although she also had difficulty with fine motor skills. Jigsaws and cutting were very difficult. By the time she started primary school, she had problems with speech, writing, dressing and cutting, and she was diagnosed with a developmental coordination disorder, or dyspraxia. As her language began to develop, she was still difficult to understand because she missed off word endings such as plurals and past tenses. She also had difficulty pronouncing words with 3 syllables or more. Her peers soon overtook her in school as she had literacy difficulties and found joining in with discussions hard. She was moved to a language unit when she was 8, as her language was developing slowly and in an unusual way, which might have indicated a specific speech and language impairment. Her interaction difficulties became more obvious as she got older. She became increasingly socially isolated and her interests narrowed in comparison to her peers. And by the time she moved to secondary school, she also had another diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. So this case study really indicates some of the impacts of having difficulties with speech, language and communication needs. I think really for Molly, we would need to think about really picking up very early on the fact that she was presenting with a language delay alongside some other difficulties with her coordination, her fine motor skills. So really for Molly, she might have been the sort of child where at age 2 or 3, we may have been able to use one of the ages and stages resource to identify that she wasn't developing in line with what as would be expected for her age, and have started to put some support in for her early on. That's not to say, you know, she does seem like the sort of child who would have had a persistent speech, language and communication difficulty. However, putting in the right support early on is never going to be harmful for a child. Even if they are going to have some long-term persistent difficulties, the more support that can be provided early on for them is really crucial. Okay. So just some of the principles to think about in terms of supporting your skills in identifying children. Really, one of the most crucial things is using observation skills and being able to report and reflect on those observations. So an observation allows us to gain a picture of speech, language and communication, and you can then use this observations to check against your ages and stages resources to see whether that child appears to be following or reaching language and communication milestones as would be expected for a child of their age. It's also good to try and use observations kind of over time. So it may be that when you see a child at 18 months old, there's no concerns, but by 3, you know, they've made very little progress, and therefore because you know that they've not progressed on, that's when you might then flag up your concerns. It's also really important to remember in terms of your observations that children's communication can vary greatly depending on the context. So for example, seeing a child at home, they might present quite differently to if they are in a small clinic room in a health centre or something like that, and also the people who they have around them. So just being with their mum at home, again, they may present very differently to being with a healthcare professional in a clinic. And it's also really important to just reflect on those observations. So taking the observation, reflecting on exactly what that means, and any further actions that may need to be taken as a result. In terms of observations, it's really important to be clear about the purpose of your observations. So, you know, almost having some kind of hypothesis that you're working towards and thinking about why it is that you're conducting that observation. Looking at speech, language and communication as part of the whole child. So as we've talked about before, it's such a central life skill that we need to be thinking about how do any difficulties that child is having impacting on their general development and their general well-being. It can be, if possible, quite nice to do planned and spontaneous observations, if that's at all possible. And it's also important that perhaps not for the children when they're very young, but certainly that their parents are aware of the fact that you are observing and looking out for any difficulties, and the reasons why you're doing that. And also, as we've said before, it's also crucial to get the views of the people who know the children best. One observation may not be enough. You may need to do more than one to really gather your thoughts and be able to reflect and gather an accurate picture of that child's needs. And just make sure that as you're doing your observation that you're noting down carefully what the child's doing, what they're saying, how they're presenting. In order to kind of complete a useful case study, these are really the key principles to think about. So you've got your observation that we've talked about just now, making sure that you do accurate recording, making careful notes of your observations, and also of the context that those observations were made in. Checking, so that's when you would take your observations, check back in terms of maybe those ages and stages resources. Analysing, so looking again back at what you've recorded and analysing what that means, and then reflecting, so thinking about what that child is able to do or not do and what that might mean for them, and also in terms of your own kind of professional development, personal development, thinking about your own observational skills and anything that you may be able to do differently next time, or things that went well for the observation. I think it's important to recognise that quite often it's us as health professionals who may be the first person to recognise that a child has any concerns, and that it is very much our role to raise these effectively, to ensure that a child receives the early support that they require. And to ensure that those potential impacts for them and their life chances are minimised. However, that quite often young children could have SLCN that are just missed completely. So it may be that some children aren't recognised as having any difficulties, perhaps until they reach secondary age, where there are a bit more demands being placed on them and their difficulties become more apparent. So it's just something to always have in the back of your mind, as something to be aware of. And lots of other children and young people might have been identified as having a different need. So it might be that they are seen as a child who has behaviour difficulties, and that is the main need that they're presenting with, but that actually there are some underlying speech, language and communication difficulties there, which you may be able to support with identifying. So it's definitely worth, just kind of as a result of this seminar, just having a think about making sure that we're all aware on how we would raise concerns, what the referral process is, if you've got an advice line that you can call, or speech and language colleagues that you can call upon to discuss any concerns that you may have. And that's just a slide just to reiterate what I've just said about making sure that you're aware of the processes and the procedures within your local areas, for if you do have concerns, how to raise those and how to get the support in place that child may need. And I think we've come to the end. That's just a few of these I spoke about throughout the presentation. So the Universally Speaking, which is the Ages and Stages resource, that can be found on the Communication Trust website and downloaded from there for free. In terms of the indicators resources, the Communication Trust has a publication called Don't Get Me Wrong, which is also in the resources section of our website. If you go to Appendix 1, at the back of that, there's a really nice indicator checklist. And also, I haven't written in here, but it was the pragmatics profile that I mentioned earlier, in terms of the interview with the parent or the caregiver about any child where you have concerns about their social communication skills. I also spoke about the I Can Talk paper, The Cost to the Nation, which really details the kind of wide and varying impacts that difficulties with speech, language and communication may have for a child. And I've just popped the Aphasic website on there, which has lots of really useful information and advice for parents and practitioners. If anybody wants to speak more to us at the Communication Trust, we have an email address that is monitored with any queries at all. Feel free to drop us a line. I'm doing the next Thinking Thursday, which I think is on the 14th of November. And that's around supporting children's speech, language and communication development. And I've also just popped here just to make you aware that there is a level 3 qualification based on developing and supporting children's speech, language and communication, if anybody's interested in extending their knowledge further on the subject. Thank you very much.